Welcome to Spread, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this fine Saturday afternoon. It was actually our organization's anniversary this past week. We are in year 3 of creating a community to support peer respect, education, and discourse. This organization can't be successful without our members, so I wanted to take some time today to look back at some of the events we did together. Cue the pictures. So personal finance and taxes with Anna and I, election series with Steven, the mix and match with the bartender Baromeo, yoga with Kim, Japanese with James, skincare with Anna and Jared, traveling with Crystal, and Python with Andy. And even though COVID hit, we took the events online and we still had our events. For example, behavioral economics with William and market mania with Hari. This organization was started because although it's fun to hang out and eat/play with everyone, we also wanted to grow together, develop together, and put our time into creating something meaningful. Especially since our interests and passions diverge as we get older, graduate from school, and find jobs, it's nice to come back together and just share with the group what maybe your current interest is in or what your passion is in. While Spread started with events, this year we've also made great strides in formalizing our event organization and planning. So thank you to the board members for your behind the scenes work. And we've also expanded to doing book clubs and volunteer activities. So I'm really looking forward to all the future activities that we're going to do together. And I'm excited to continue growing this org with you all. If you're new and interested, feel free to DM me your email so you can get event notifications. But today I'm very excited to introduce Steven. Let me, yeah. Stephen, our seasoned Spread speaker, who has done talks on lawmaking, policy, and elections. He went to school at UCLA with a focus on political science and a minor in philosophy. And he will be pursuing his master's in public policy this fall. His current interests lie in economics and how that affects policies and society. Today, he will be speaking on macroeconomics. Can Biden just print money? What is Keynesian economic theory and what is the impact of printing money on the economy? So without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Stephen.
Oh, snap. That was the most professional intro ever. Thanks,
Thanks.
Carmen.
I practiced.
Right. Let me share my screen and we'll jump into it. Thanks everybody for coming. I don't think I have to introduce myself. I recognize everybody in here. So thanks for showing up. Today, we are going to be talking about macroeconomics. The material is pretty dense, so hopefully these progress bars help. You notice in the upper left, these are kind of the main points here. And then on the bottom is kind of where we are in that current chapter, so to speak. Please do interrupt me if things are not clear or you need to explain how something ties into the larger presentation. Feel free to type it in the chat or just interrupt me. I know it's a little more awkward in Zoom, but we used to interrupt each other all the time when we met in person. So feel free. I'm expecting about maybe 45 minutes. We'll take a break kind of in the halfway point. And then we'll have an open discussion at the end if anyone has ideas and stuff. Today, we're going to be talking about money. You don't need me to tell you that money dictates our quality of life. If you don't have it and you don't have the means to get more of it, you're going to have a bad time. Your life is going to suck in many ways. Money is what motivates us to get up in the morning and go do our jobs. Not because jobs are so incredibly fun, but because we need money for food and shelter to survive today and tomorrow. It allows us to buy in to society and to be productive, to do things that are valued by somebody somewhere. Buying into that program also means that we aren't using our time to do crazy things in order to secure a better future for ourselves. There are, of course, different levels to having money. Try to put yourself in the shoes of the following people. If you've ever been in a situation where your family had no wealth, no job, or minimal earnings, you understand the constant stress of just trying to survive. This man on the right, who's not sure how he will feed his kids, know that money is existentially important. If he only had some more money, he would feel 100 times better, more clear-headed, and more prepared to develop long-term plans. Those who have a steady income and stable finances, they appreciate their paychecks and seek as much as they can in order to be secure and to buy goods and services. Finally, those with more money than they know what to do with seek investments to grow their money even more. Each additional dollar they have has less impact on their lives, and soon it's all just a game. Those who have assets that generate more income and wealth than they can spend in lifetimes know that money brings status, dignity, and power over others. This gap in the quality of life and lived experience, it's all caused by a lack of money. We're all living in the same economy, but there's a huge gap between living an easy life and a life of anxiety, despair, health issues, and so on and so forth that are caused and made worse by being poor. Is the economy not big enough to support everybody? Are there simply not enough resources to feed and to house everybody? I wondered where our resources are currently situated. So I did some digging around, and here's a little thought experiment. First, the US economy. The total US wealth, according to Forbes, is $112.5 trillion. This is the total value of things that we have in America. If the United States were 100 people, one person would have 34.2 trillions of that total. And the bottom 50 would have just $2.1 trillion. Presented visually, we have this graph. Then I asked, what is the minimum that we could ask for in this life? 3 meals a day and a roof over our heads. I chose these 3 things here, and I'll explain what I mean by them. But this is just a quick thought experiment, and you could very well ask, how much would it cost to buy everybody a Prius or something like that? The goal here is just to visualize and compare our nation's wealth and the cost of certain things. First, let's talk about food. What does it cost to feed a person in America? I came up with a random figure of $25 a day or $9,000 a year. To feed 330 million adults, it would cost $3 trillion per year. And you can see in the bottom right what that looks like visually. To give everybody shelter, the national average cost to build 1 unit of affordable housing is $345,000. Recent estimates estimate 600,000 homeless individuals in the United States. So you multiply 600,000 by the cost to build 1 unit of housing, and you have the total of $207 billion. This is such a small fraction of national wealth that you can hardly see it on the graph. And finally, a random amount of $60,000 per year, could be spent on food and rent, whatever. If you do the math, multiplied by 210 million adults, the cost would be $12.6 trillion. And that's how it looks visually. So this was just an exercise to keep things in perspective. It's not a policy proposal, but a look at the economy from a really big picture point of view. It would be a huge deal if, the single mother living in their minivan was able to have access to housing. But in the big picture shown on our graph, it's barely a drop in the bucket. We go to work every day we, do our budgets, we buy food, we pay bills, but rarely do we get to think about the economy as a whole. One of my goals today is to take the fish out of the water, so to speak, and see our economy from the top down. Think about what $112.5 trillion represents. It's the current value of the things we as a nation have made up to this point in time. Millions of people working, thinking, and interacting over a few centuries. And this is what we have to show for it. We've produced goods and services, we've built and maintained real estate, supply chains, created technology, processes, machines. We invested in education, in healthcare, so on and so forth. And we only started with the resources from the environment. It is an immense achievement that most of us can live lives that ancient kings could only dream about. I contrasted this wealth with some of the darker realities of our economies. People freeze and starve on the streets despite living in the richest nation in the history of the world. The difference was whether you had or didn't have money. Why is it that people fall through the cracks? Why is it that most Americans find themselves in shaky financial situations, not prepared to meet a $1,000 financial emergency? Well, our discussion today is going to be super big picture, so we need to take a few steps back. I want you to think of our economy as a system with rules developed over time. Imagine a very simple system somebody might have, like an automated plant care system that waters the plant every 24 hours and adds fertilizer every 2 weeks. If you wanted a very healthy plant, you'd have to ask yourself, are these the best rules to have the healthiest plant? Or should maybe we adjust the rules? Maybe we should water it more often, so on and so forth. Tweaking these rules will result in huge differences over time. Our economy, of course, is a lot more complex than a plant system, but it is similarly affected by rules that produce different results. We used to have rules like Black people are property, and therefore they can't earn money, they can't own land, and everything else. Of course, Lincoln freed the slaves only for them to face immense barriers that prevented not only basic dignity, but the chance to accumulate wealth. Generation after generation lost time and opportunity. It's only been 50 years since important civil rights legislation passed. So it's not hard to imagine why the wealth and the income disparity between races are so pronounced today. Another example of rules is the Anti-Coolie Act of 1862. This was passed to protect white workers by imposing a monthly tax on Chinese immigrants trying to do business in California. To show the power of rules and results over time, imagine if it were your great-great-grandparents back in 1862 that was subjected to this tax. They were set back $2.50 per month, which is the equivalent of $65 today. And therefore, they did not have that money to do productive things. The math gets kind of funky with inflation over time, but if you were to invest $65 today and $65 every month over 150 years, the results are pretty crazy, right? The final balance is $297 million. The power of wealth and compound interest over time helps explain the difference in generational wealth and the disparity in lifestyles. Just like a race with different starting points and rules that disadvantage specific people, it's very easy to guess the results. Our current trajectory should be a cause for concern. This graph shows the average income of different groups in the last 40 years. And in the last 40 years, the income of the top 1% has risen dramatically, while everybody else takes what they can get. Thinking about our economy as a system gives us the perspective that we citizens need when considering policy proposals from politicians. Individually, we're all just doing our best for ourselves and our families, but as a society, we should ask whether or not rules need to be made, changed, or abolished to produce different results. You might ask, why have rules at all? Maybe there's some natural logic to a free market where everybody thinks hard about the choices they have in front of them and makes decisions to their best ability when taking jobs or making trades. Let's do just a quick poll. Just type in the chat option 1 or option 2. If you believe if there's some natural logic in the free markets that let them exist on their own, or maybe there has always been rules determined by governments. So quick 30 seconds, there's no right or wrong answer. And sweet. In this day and age, it's clearly not 100% one side or the other. And one of the main reasons for that is John Maynard Keynes. Keynes remains the most influential economist of the last 120 years or so. Despite the resurgence of free marketers from the 1960s to today, we know that government intervention in economies is crucial to getting economies back on track when they run into problems. His ideas are why governments from both parties passed 4 major stimulus packages in the last 20 years, totaling more than $5 trillion in government spending. Keynes is a titan in the field because he actively tried to solve the practical and systemic economic problems of the day, as opposed to justifying the case for doing nothing. Today, we're going to explore those ideas. The main ideas of Keynes was that the economy was more about society's confidence in its stability and its ability to meet the future than it is about free market principles. Secondly, that governments play a primary role in signaling confidence and helping to maintain a strong economy by actively investing in it. Third, that these direct investments should be toward public projects that free markets don't address well. In general, he was concerned with solving immediate problems instead of waiting for market equilibrium to solve those problems in the long run. My goal for today is to brief you on Keynes' general philosophy, so you have something to reference whenever you hear about government spending in the news. The reason some of us believe that free markets are natural is because of the very true logic of market systems. Supply and demand result in efficient production of goods and efficient allocation of resources. So this is the most standard supply and demand graph. Supply is this line here, demand is this line here, and the price point is where they intersect. When supply increases, if this whole bar moves to the right while demand stays the same, then the intersection point will be lower, and therefore the price will decrease. On the other hand, if demand increases, this bar moves to the right while supply stays the same. The price point will be higher. So what that means is more people demand a good while supply stays the same. People are going to end up paying more for that product. This is very efficient because without anybody forcing or telling people to make 1,000 cars, for example, the number of cars that are going to be made is based on the amount of people willing to buy those cars at certain prices. Cars will eventually get to people who want them based on what the prices are. This is desirable because we don't want to have to put our trust and our faith in people who will inevitably make mistakes and or abuse their power. For example, Mao Zedong famously told people to go kill sparrows who were thought to be eating too much of the nation's grain, instead of allowing market supply and demand to work its magic. This resulted in the Great Famine, which killed up to 55 million Chinese people. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union's extremely strict 5-year economic plans led to up to 7 million dead Soviets and pitiful economic wealth for their people. It famously could not measure up to the modern miracle of US supermarkets. This is Soviet Minister Boris Yeltsin amazed at the abundance of US supermarkets. Market capitalism is awesome because it allows us to benefit from the work of millions of people. Instead of trying to fight people's self-interest, we can harness and take advantage of it to get people to do productive things without coercion. All of these people trying as hard as they can to make as much money as possible results in the abundance we see on the right. This is way better than threatening someone to do the work, even if it's for the good of the people. In Keynes's youth, free market allowed his country to enjoy significant and consistent increases in quality of life for everybody. It allowed imperial nations to trade with each other for the things that they did not have. It took advantage of a key principle in market theory, comparative advantage, which says that everybody is better off if they focus on making what they're good at making and trading for what others are good at making, instead of trying to make many things less well. In the end, both sides are more productive and wealthier. This was also a huge improvement from the inefficient central planning of kings and queens. And even though the returns of international trade were not equal, countries like Britain did not see internal strife because everyone's piece of the pie was ultimately bigger, whether they were factory workers or wealthy capitalists. So this was all good and dandy until it wasn't. This Gilded Age, as it is called, relied upon exploiting other countries, which caused nationalism and anger. This anger led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which caused a complicated web of alliances to be called upon, and eventually that's how World War I started. This ended the Gilded Age by disrupting international trade agreements and disrupting the logic of the international money supply, which was based on gold. This is an example of what we would call a shock or a crisis that catches markets off guard and exposes its weaknesses. International contracts cannot be executed or honored. French businesses owed German businesses money and vice versa, but now they were suddenly at war. Business accounts all over were in trouble. Spending and investment came to a stop. Banks faced failure as citizens began withdrawing massive amounts of money, afraid that their bank was insolvent and wanted to have their money before the bank ran out of it. This created a huge crisis because money was based on gold. And this gold crisis was one of the first economic problems that Keynes helped to solve. And that's why we're going to go into some detail, because it explains first one of the reasons why we use our current form of money, but also shows how Keynes approached economic problems. The gold standard means that a certain amount of money that you had was equal to a certain amount of gold. The gold standard was a way for everyone in the world to know the general value of what they had internationally. Each currency was essentially an IOU for how many ounces of gold you could redeem, and therefore you always knew how rich you were. But since there's a limited amount of gold in the world, if you base your currency on gold, that means there's a limited total amount of money. This became a problem at the start of World War I because when nations stopped international payments and hoarded gold in order to be more prepared for the future, money suddenly stopped moving. It suddenly became scarce. When money becomes scarce, nations and citizens withdraw their money, and governments not having money means they're unable to pay people to do things. They're unable to create programs, and literally to do things. When everybody is scared to make loans and spend money, people start to lose jobs and society degrades. Governments also can't create gold out of thin air. So they can either try to print more of those IOUs and cause inflation, or they have to depend on other countries to lend them gold. If no one wanted to lend them gold, then they were screwed and had extremely limited options to get their economy moving again. Facing this crisis, Keynes convinced the British government to issue a currency that was not tied to any physical object. It was just paper, but it was backed by the British government. Well, this ultimately worked, and it brought stability to the domestic money supply, while at the same time protecting the stock of British gold. Britain was able to maintain its status as the financial capital of the world while keeping its internal economy running with a money supply. The genius of Keynes was that he was always thinking outside the box, always a level above what even the big CEOs and ministers thought were hard rules. Keep an eye out for that level of perspective as we explore more of his ideas later. In this case, the British crisis began to show Keynes the fragility of free markets based on currencies of fixed value. Unfortunately, Keynes didn't have the means to get the world off of the gold standard. Internationally, the gold standard remained. The US would end up being the main lender of World War I, and the financial agreements between countries to pay off war debts would cause great disagreements and domestic bitterness that ultimately resulted in World War II. Under common sense market logic, the money that Europeans borrowed during the war from the United States in order to buy their weapons, to pay their soldiers, and to rebuild their countries, it had to be paid back. And Europeans after World War I were determined to have Germany pay for their sins. A large part of Germany's economic productivity after World War I went toward meeting its war reparations and greatly angered the German people. Imagine if a significant amount of your taxes were going overseas to rebuild foreign nations and not to improve your life at home. To try and combat this, Germany printed a lot of money, which caused hyperinflation, as they had no economic resources or productivity to back up that money. A quick primer on inflation. Inflation is when you have more and more money chasing a limited number of goods. Eventually, each unit of that good would cost more and more of that money to buy. For example, if your economy had a total of $5 in the money supply, and a carrot was worth $1 at the time, if you suddenly doubled the amount of money in the money supply while not increasing the amount of carrots, you would have more money chasing the same amount of carrots. The carrot is no longer going to be worth $1 because the amount of carrots did not double. It would now be worth $2, or 1/5 of the total money supply, if that's an easier way to think of it. Germany kept increasing their total money supply to the point of absurdity. France at one point even invaded Germany to take control of valuable coal mines in order to extract real resources instead of accepting trash German money. This is a 5 billion mark bill in Germany in 1923. When inflation gets this bad, prices rise and change by the minute. You can imagine how miserable this can be. Hitler took advantage of an unhappy citizens, blaming foreigners and Jews for the sad state of the German economy and promising the return of German dignity. Instead of playing by the rules of the international economy, Hitler said, "Screw this, we're going to do things our own way." He provided a story that was separate from the financial history of World War I. He provided a story that motivated Germans to work and to produce things. Germany went on the warpath to go and capture real land and real resources. And the rest is, of course, history. This understanding of World War II is an example of the shortcomings of the markets. The powers of the world did not have a way to prevent the absolute human disaster that was World War II, which resulted from the economics of international markets. They were too constrained by the rules of finance of accounts and balances, and they couldn't see any solution that would avoid the consequences. A couple other examples of the limit of free market theories are price gouging and the inability to address public needs. Just a few years ago, after Hurricane Harvey, people were selling food and water for crazy prices. Free marketers would say, this is fine. High prices are good because it signals to suppliers that there's a market here, there's a demand here, and it encourages them to bring more water into that area. Eventually, the prices would lower as consumers buy them, and then consumers will have more ability to buy them later as prices go down. But of course, you can only go a few days without water, and if you drink dirty water, you're also screwed. Markets also don't adequately address public goods. For example, you live on a block with other people, but no one has the incentive to come up with the cash needed to lay sewage pipes to each house that everybody will use. In developing countries, of course, communities empty their raw sewage into the area around their house that eventually seeps into the groundwater, which they eventually use, leading to diseases. These are cases where the benefits of free markets are not adequate for the real world. On the other hand, Keynes developed a theory that is meant to produce real world prosperity. At this point, they want to pause, maybe take a couple minutes. If people have questions about the material. But I think we'll move on in a few minutes.
All right, I have a question.
Yeah.
So there was a slide where you said gold standard, something, and then my question is, so you're saying if people want to withdraw their money and not spend in today's economy, like we won't go into as big a recession as if we were still using gold standard, or?
Yeah, so your question is, what was the consequence if people stop spending?
In today's economy, like fiat currency versus gold standard.
In both cases, when people stop spending money and when people stop, doing what they normally do with money, the economy slows down. There's no there's no real equilibrium because things are always in motion. What would happen? But when things are on the up and up and the economies heat up, that's when people start spending more and more money, and money flows around quickly. And that's when we see growth. When people stop spending money and it influences other people to also stop spending money, that's when things slow down and we go into recession or depression. A lot of times, both of these processes are kicked off or abruptly ended with shocks or crises or huge developments. Technology also comes into play. But in general, to answer your question, economies depend on people spending money and transferring money to other people. The question for economists is how to control the pace of this movement and not have it move too fast, and also prevent things from slowing down and going into cycles.
Why is it bad if you have money that moves too fast?
It's bad because the federal government is always introducing money into the system, and the most common measure of the speed of the economy, so to speak, is inflation. And so when there's a process where commercial banks can create more money because they lend more money than they have in their accounts. And if they keep doing this over time, that increases the total money supply. It's called it's referred to as I think it's called fractional banking, where if you're a bank, you don't need to have 100 million in your account to lend someone 100 million. But once you maybe only have 20 million, you lend out 100 million, suddenly the total money supply has been expanded. So money has been created out of thin air. So we don't want, commercial banks are always, that's their main product. They want to make loans. That's how they make their money. So how do we get the commercial banks to chill out and slow down? The government makes rules that says, hey, you must have like maybe 20% of your total loans in liquid in your account. And therefore, if you like raise that threshold, then they can't loan as much out, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's the main thing that the federal government controls as far as.
Isn't there also interest rates where it like encourages and discourages people from like taking out too much, or like they actually encourage them to take out more?
That's the primary mechanism that the government has to control the pace of money going into the economy. That's what the Federal Reserve. We're not going to get into too much detail about the mechanics of it, but whenever you hear that the Federal Reserve is meeting and talking about their future plans about what the interest rate that they will set in the next 6 months or a year, that's what they're talking about. Because if they raise interest rates, it means it's more expensive to borrow money. Making it more expensive to borrow money means less people will do it. And if less people borrow money, then there's less money moving around. So I think we'll leave it at that. We'll come back to it later. But we are going to move on. I don't know why my thing.
Curtis asked a
sorry.
question like way back in the beginning. He wanted to clarify the graph all the way back, the bar graphs at the beginning, is 112 trillion total wealth is generated per year, or what was that number? I forgot which one.
No, that's not generated per year. It's the current value of United States wealth. So it's like it's a static as of the time that Forbes printed the article and came up with that number.
Okay.
Okay, my thing refreshed, but let me go back. So after the hurricanes and disasters that we talked about earlier, like Hurricane Harvey, people, of course, they still need food, they still need shelter, they still need water. And as we see during the COVID disaster, people obviously have real needs, and governments must implement real plans to address things immediately. Sure, if we all did nothing and time went on and events would unfold as they might have unfolded, there may eventually be some type of market equilibrium that is eventually reached. Deaths from Hurricane Katrina could have reached more than 2,000 people, and COVID could have killed as much as 1 million Americans or more if governments hadn't imposed restrictions, funded vaccine research, and funded the manufacturing of PPE. The moral of the story, according to Keynes, was that waiting for the markets to suffer those crises would eventually satisfy the market theories, but at the cost of a disruption of social order and real human suffering. To advocate market theory above all else is to ignore the real world problems that markets either have no incentive or no ability to solve in a timely manner. If societies had the collective means to address societal problems, as we did during COVID, why should we wait for the markets to move and simply suffer quietly in the meantime? If the federal government did not guarantee sales of the COVID vaccine, how much slower would the vaccine rollout could have taken? We might have been like Europe, who declined to place huge orders of the vaccine even before the vaccines were approved. And so now they're struggling to find supply. Remember that our country was in the worst situation in the world regarding COVID until the vaccines started rolling out. If the supply of vaccines were limited because the government didn't fund companies to do the research, then we might still be in the third wave. Keynes put great emphasis in the role of human agency and political decisions in economics. He thought that the government should act to address social problems. In fact, he believed that governments actually preceded markets. In his work, A Treatise on Money, Keynes explicitly argued that money was first created by governments in order to exert their political influence and authority over their subjects. This is a theory of money where money are units of account used to create obligations between people. Obligations between people can mean anything. For example, if I mow Bowden's lawn, we can agree together that he owes me a similar favor down the road. The difference between my relationship with Bowden and my relationship with the government is that the government alone determines what will count as that obligation, what will count as money. And since the government, of course, forces taxes on people, all instances of that money, whatever they determine it to be, are therefore potential debts to the government. It's important to note that these are all human decisions. Me owing Bowden $5 or me having a $1,000 tax bill doesn't mean that the laws of nature or physics are updated somewhere. Money is a political tool. And since the existing powers can decide what is considered money, they can also decide that some debts can just be forgiven. After World War I, for example, the Allies were deciding how much debt they wanted to place upon Germany. On one side, the idea was that we should oppress Germany with the crushing economic obligations for as long as possible. And on the other side, the more optimistic side, said we should be lenient on Germany. We should not have such a big debt placed on them because we want them to create an economy that brought its citizens prosperity and therefore hopefully bring about peace in the future. It was ultimately a political decision. Keynes actually asked the United States to dismiss some of the debt that it was owed by Europe, but he was basically told to piss off. The economic shackles that binded Europe after World War I and that ultimately forced World War II was brought upon themselves. Another example of political authority is when a war chief defeats a rival in battle. They then install their own subordinate leaders as dukes and give them control of land, resources, and labor. In this case, due to the political decisions of war, a person is granted great riches and easy lives, not because they used the logic of free markets, but because they knew the guy in charge. On the other hand, if you were on the new boss's shit list, one tool of retribution would be to burden you with unimaginable debt. Think, for example, of the sharecroppers after the Civil War. Debts were placed on entities in order to subjugate them and extract value from them. Think as well of the future, where the Biden administration is considering forgiving about $10,000 of student debt. With the passing of legislation or a simple executive order, a burden is lifted and the lives of a chosen class are improved. With any legislation or action of the political authority, taxes are levied or repealed and fortunes are made or destroyed. Another example is that it's tax season. Why has it historically been hard to find a way to file taxes for free? Or why do you even have to file them in the first place? Did you know that other nations simply do your taxes for you and send you the numbers in order for you to verify? Instead, TurboTax has been lobbying the federal government for decades and is now a $70 billion company with very comfortable market share. They influence the government to create an empire. In modern times, the fact that Keynes' theories sound incredibly foreign, it shows how much we've forgotten about the political realities of economics. In our political discourse, we've been worshiping the market like a deity, like a god. For 30 years, our chief economist and money manager was this guy. Between the 1980s and 2006, we all mostly agreed that this was the smartest economics person that we had. He said this in 1998 of the idea that financial markets needed regulating. Regulation of derivatives transactions that are privately negotiated by professionals is unnecessary. It would serve no useful purpose and impede the efficiency of markets to enlarge standards of living. This was the dominant thinking of that time. And that time would be like 30 or 40 years of our recent political history. Congress would go so far as to pass a law banning federal regulation of credit default swaps and even exempted them from state anti-gambling rules. This was the belief in the free markets that we talked about before the break. The market's rules and logic are important in themselves and are crucial to predicting certain things. But do we think that the market is powerful enough to solve the real problems of our time and to guarantee stability through future issues and shocks and crises? The market works according to its logic until it encounters problems that are outside its scope. When these problems occur, market solutions, which simply tell us to stand by as the market works to correct the situation, often take too long to be acceptable to society. And it turns out that these problems occur rather regularly. World War I, World War II, oil shocks, bubbles, crashes, financialization, speculation, the Great Recession, the most recent global pandemic, the list goes on. One influential Keynesian scholar said that there were no such things as normal periods in history. Remember those credit default swaps from a couple slides before? Credit default swaps were one of the main financial products that would cause the 2008 financial crisis. Indeed, after the dot-com bubble burst in 2001 and the financial crisis of 2008, which led to the Great Recession, Mr. Greenspan had this to say: "Those who have looked to the self-interest of markets to protect people's money, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief." Referring to his free market ideas, Greenspan said, "I have found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact." When he was pressed by a congressman, in other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working. "Absolutely, precisely," Greenspan replied. "You know, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well." So he was wrong. He was like, you know, all my math and calculations are wrong. What's going on here? His amazing career and his legacy as an economist has yet to recover. One of Keynes's main interests was how to act in the face of uncertainty. He dismissed any notions by economists who proclaimed that they had a model that could serve as organizing principles for society. Instead, he believed that economics did not uncover the unshakable laws of nature, but only describes trends in human political arrangements. He didn't think economic principles created facts, but that they merely explained the consequences. What did determine the future were the relationships between people and how we can agree on future paths that society will take. We are always together facing an uncertain future. How do we create markets and economies that are the most resilient in the face of that uncertainty? And in the near certainty that there will be future events that will surprise us and test our economic systems. Keynes believed that peace and social stability were the most prized pursuits of economics. Because stability was so important, we showed how currency is a fixed value based on the gold standard. Keynes didn't believe that fixed value currencies had any part to play in the future. Things like Bitcoin he would dismiss because they're too rigid to serve the stabilizing purpose that money was supposed to play. Instead, governments need control of flexible currencies and use the tools at their disposal to create economies that address public issues and encourage productivity while somehow avoiding central planning. So in the final section of the presentation, we're going to discuss Keynes's suggestions. Money needs to be spent in economies in order to get people employed and involved in being a productive part of society. Once the money stops flowing, people are laid off, they become bitter, hateful, and susceptible to populists like Trump, like Duterte, and all these other people around the world. When money stops flowing, it means that people aren't starting new companies. They're not funding new research, and they're not taking calculated risks based on the future expectation of returns. In short, money not being spent means people are worried about the future. And this is the main concern. The anxiety or the lack of confidence in tomorrow is the key problem of economies in recession and depression. As Keynes pointed out during the Great Depression, the productive capabilities of the country didn't change at all. The collapse in stock prices did not mean that a corresponding percentage of the labor force was suddenly killed off, or a portion of the machines and raw material were suddenly lost. The potential output of the economy will always remain high. It's just a matter of influencing things on the ground to reach that potential future. In this project, market forces, they can't help. They only make things worse by following the signals of the market. Here, only a political authority can quell the fears and to proclaim to the people that tomorrow is secure. That's why the action of the British government during the pre-World War I gold panic worked. They came up with a whole new currency for the domestic economy, and they were lucky it was accepted by the public. The people stopped withdrawing their gold, and that step by the government, they bought into it, which saved the day. Government, being in the unique position that it is in, is the only player left to signal to the economy that the economy was still worth investing in. It leads the way by investing and spending. It can spend on anything that employs people, but most logically, it should spend on projects that benefit the public good: infrastructure, health, education, etc. In Britain, after the Great Depression, they started the National Health Service, unemployment insurance, pensions for old people, widows, disabled. In the US, FDR's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's New Deal created Medicare, Medi-Cal, Social Security, food stamps, PBS, NPR, etc. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations signed stimulus bills in the face of economic recessions. So we learned that government stimulus is necessary in order to prevent extended downturns. Today is not even a debate that the government needs to stimulate the economy when things go bad. With Keynesian focus on consumer stimulus, our recovery after the recession was way better than our recovery following the Great Depression, where we thought we had to be fiscally conservative and balance our federal budget, for example. The red line is the from January 2008 to the present, and the blue line is back after the Great Depression, and you'll see that the recovery took like half the time. All these government interventions in the free market ballooned government deficits, which means when you're spending more than you're earning, you have a deficit. One of the main ideas of Keynesian theory says that this is okay because every dollar that the government spends creates multiples of that dollar in economic activity. A dollar paid to a worker building a bridge results in that dollar being spent in local restaurants, buying houses nearby, and therefore employing people that work in that restaurant, people that build those houses, and not to mention the increased economic activity that is traveling on the bridge that the worker is building. Under this line of thinking, the only thing that stops governments like the US from just keep printing money is inflation. So how do we manage money, address the deficit, and battle inflation? Well, one answer is to grow the economy to create more products, which means in our example here, creating more carrots so that the cost of the carrot is in line with the increase in the money supply. Another way is to increase taxes to remove money from the system. If the problem is too much money in the system, we need to take some of that money out, and therefore the ratio of money to things that you can buy is stabilized. This is one diagram that shows the flow of money. Okay, so government creates money in the beginning, and they can either lend it to commercial banks, which makes loans to businesses. Businesses, of course, buy things and they pay people to work, and then people buy stuff and or save the money. The government money can also be paid directly to public agencies and public employees, which go on to do the same thing. They buy stuff or so on and so forth. But in the end, taxes remove money from the system. Keynes went so far as to suggest that 2/3 of the economy should be government funded, doing work in the public interest, like all the projects we mentioned before. This would make an economy that was much less susceptible to market shocks, while still leaving room for market industries. The flow of government money, which is this flow here, government creates money, employing more people than they do now, and then controlling the money at the back end as well. The flow of government money would be the lifeblood of such an economy. Unemployment would remain low because the government was hiring so many people, and society can engage in projects that secure a better future for the public. After all, the cost or the price tag isn't represented in real things like a limited amount of gold chasing scarce resources. Today, money is printed when the central bank electronically lends or deposits money directly to the accounts of commercial banks. Or recently, as we've seen, literally directly into your bank account in the form of stimulus money. Somebody literally just types zeros into a screen to quote unquote create money. Most of today's money supply is all digital. Money is no longer a symbol of a physical thing that exists in the world. It's simply a tool to organize society. And we can, of course, employ it in different ways to achieve different results. Employ it according to free market theory as we have been doing, and you'll see what we're seeing with the inequality in income and wealth. But if government spending and programs make up 2/3 of our economy, wouldn't that crowd out private enterprise? Later Keynesians argue that a large portion of the economy produces frivolous or extra unnecessary products that are only demanded due to advertisements or people think that they need it, but they really don't need it. For instance, do people really need any of these products? Does society really need robot vacuums? We're using a lot of resources and energy to build these kinds of products while people starve and roads go unmaintained. The basic needs of society are affordable if a society is inclined to try and secure those things for its people. Would we be better off employing people to secure those basic needs like food and shelter, etc., or by producing these types of things? What's the point of working 40+ hours a week to make random things or to create yet another social media app when we already know what will make the world a better place? We've come far past the technological and productive capabilities needed to truly bring about a better world, yet we slave away to get the latest and the greatest. If we see macroecon through Keynes's lens, we see how he pays for his utopia through optimism and hope for the future. From where he sat in the 1930s, he predicted that based on the rate of technological change, his generation's grandchildren would work 15-hour work weeks and enjoy lives of leisure. Back in the day, he wrote, "The course of affairs will simply be that there will be ever larger and larger classes and groups of people from whom problems of economic necessity have been practically removed." He also wrote that the economic problem is not the permanent problem of the human race. Instead, it will be to occupy leisure with meaningful activities like we're doing right now with spread. Keynes' vision was written 100 years ago. Since then, our economy has chugged along, managing to be more and more productive year after year. Yet somehow a larger percentage of us fall into poverty and homelessness. The people I mentioned at the start of the presentation lacked money because they lacked secure jobs. Meanwhile, the government spent $4.5 trillion in 2019. Could the government print money and employ everyone who wanted a job? What work would they do? They would work in securing public goods like food or building units of housing. How about inflation? Well, Keynes had a solution for that too. He wanted to reduce the money supply by taxing the super wealthy. Keynes did not like the idea of landlords and investors, capitalists who simply leverage the scarcity of capital to make more money and contribute to inequality. So my reading of Keynes tells me he's less concerned about the dollar costs of programs, so long as society is productive, stable, and progressing towards real-world prosperity. He provided a theory that allows society to prevent and to respond to economic turmoil, and taking advantage of stability to invest in itself and its future. As the Biden administration embarks on a new Keynesian adventure, some big questions remain. Although Keynes points out that there's a difference between the economy of real things like houses and food and the economy of the money supply, we have to consider that our deficit spending in the last couple of decades did not seem to have paid for itself. Is this because of a flaw in the multiplier theory, or is it because of tax cuts in recent decades? Should we be more concerned about the debt, or is it truly a path to prosperity? Are these deficits an encouraging sign of government investment and playing an active role in society, or is it fiscal mismanagement? The question of whether free markets should prevail or big government should prevail is essentially a question about whether we have the knowledge to affect the system and to shape it, or whether we think it's better to do nothing. That's all I have. So we'll just we'll move to discussion. Thanks, guys. So what do you guys think? Is this like a feasible theory, or where do you find weaknesses? Don't all speak at once now.
I
my
think,
opinion.
I'm sorry. But I think there's a lot of outside factors that really affect the market as well. So then I do love the whole thing where, like, in a perfect world, like this could all work out. But I think there's a lot of human nature and also, like I said, outside factors that really affect how these policies could be executed, and also how it affects like people differently. Because there are people, how do I say it? People start life with different social economic backgrounds, and how the market affects them is different depending on their upbringing. So in a perfect world, your theory is very feasible.
Can we get maybe a little specific, like somebody who grew up in a specific situation versus somebody who grew up in a different situation?
Yeah.
Honestly,
if we look back to how African Americans in our country, how they were brought here and put through slavery, and even till this day, they don't have the economic advantages that you and I might have. So that's why there are policies recently to try to give them reparation, so then they can and get more of the economic advantages that you and parents probably came here and had a little more than like how through all these centuries in this country that they still don't have access to a lot of employment and services, or maybe because someone look at them and they don't trust them to give them that loan. So there's a lot that's going through my head, and it's like not coming out as like smoothly as I want it to be.
No, it's all good. Does the room think that this, this theory could address the concerns that Joy brought up? Could it address some of the, like Black folks started off like way behind the starting line of some other folks, us included? Do people think this theory is a way to address that or not? Let me say it more explicitly. So one of the public projects that Keynes would think the government should embark upon would be to, give everybody a place to live, right? And not just because it's a good thing, but because this will actually keep the economy running and prevent, the Great Depression and disasters like that.
So you're basically saying, like, is it a good thing to give people housing? Like, I'm not really sure I understand the question.
The question is, well, the theory says that the government should literally give money to people. Like they should employ as many people as possible doing, good things in order to keep the economy running. When the government disappears from the scene and it somehow depends on the market to correct itself, the lack of government action in before the Great Depression was what contributed to how deep and long lasting that depression was. And so on the economic side, Keynes is saying government needs to be there, government needs to be present and get things moving. And combining it with what I was speaking with Joy was, hey, here's a group of people that are super disadvantaged. One of the projects that government could do out of anything they wanted to do is maybe to correct those inequalities and inequities. Does that sound viable? Are there some issues with that?
Yes, so I mean, in general, government stimulus is good for the economy because, like, if people aren't spending, then like people just keep losing jobs while it just kind of goes down that downward spiral. So I guess, like, yeah, it's good for the government to be spending, but I think that policy has to be shaped in a way that it'll target the people that need it the most. So for example, stimulus checks, like, it's a good thing where they have salary caps where people that are pretty well off don't need the stimulus checks and don't receive them, because otherwise it doesn't really help close any gaps,
Mhm.
And Amy said, is the housing 100% no strings attached? Yeah, that also brings up a the point that I want to tell you, Stephen, that like sometimes housing is like they expect them to be like what does it say? It depends. Like if it's housing to just give it housing, give them housing, like good. But like if there's like say that it's like a loans thing, like with interest, that's also different. And where like it might give people more burden and it gives them more stress to be like, oh my God, I can't pay this month. I'm gonna have to choose between food and rent and like paying this housing mortgage and stuff like that.
Related to that question is the specific policies is literally up to the government, of course, right? And we are all tangentially part of that in the future. If you take this theory, what I presented, and the pipe dream, so to speak, right, which sees a federal government with a much more enlarged position in society, they would very well say, hey, you don't have to borrow money. We're gonna literally build this project, give the housing no strings attached to anyone who wants, any adult who wants it. There's a lot of details to mess with, but what the government would do is open the floodgates, right? Because money is not real. We just want people to be productively employed. So they'll find that the building of housing employs a lot of people. The maintaining of the housing will employ a lot of people. And from Keynesian's perspective, it's all good as long as people are working and the economy isn't going off the deep end one way or the other. So we're not here talking about, oh, should we should we do like monthly checks of their rooms or something? These tiny policy details, it's all up to whoever's in charge, of course. Kenneth, econ major. How does this jive with what you're learning in the classroom? Anyone have they need made? It was a pretty dense presentation for sure.
Be interested in knowing like the opposite argument, like people who think.
Yeah, I guess one contrary argument I could maybe bring up was like, how do we pay for all this? At some point the bill will come due in some sense. How do we pay for all this?
Thanks, Rich. The the whole question of paying for something, how do you say? So the dollars you're earning, right, that you see in your bank account from your employer, those, that value, that those digits, those numerical values that you see in your bank account, something about that seems kind of sacred, right? It means something very important because of course it determines your quality of life, as we've said. But in the big picture, like in the very big picture, it doesn't really mean anything. Somebody could very well, you heard of stories where like banks accidentally deposit like $2 billion in some individuals' accounts and forgets about it for like 2 years. It doesn't really matter to the bank. That's just a rounding error for them. So to answer the question of how do you pay for things, the US government is like a lot of governments around the world where they can print their way out of trouble. When you borrow from the US government, they're always going to pay you back because they're just going to create the money they need to print you back, to pay
All
you
right.
back.
Counterpoint.
Yes.
The country of Greece. What happened? Why didn't they just print themselves out of their catastrophe that happened?
Because the European Union did not allow them to. They're in the Eurozone, so they don't control their own money. So it's like a political thing as well. The Germans are very, especially Angela Merkel, who's the head of Germany, who was one of the main political heavyweights of the European Union. She's very fiscally conservative or responsible. You know what I mean? She doesn't believe in all this like spend as you want it. She thought that it was a shortcoming of the Greek people to, like they mismanaged their economy and therefore we shouldn't let them get off easy. We should make them pay what they owe. And so therefore they negotiated a way out for Greece, which was austerity, which is they really need to cut down on their expenditures and get their finances in order. So that's what I mean when I say it's a political decision. Kind of depends who you ask and like what ideas they have. If you guys have studied Keynes, you guys have heard him, that famous quote where he says, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but it says, ideas are what runs the world, if you guys remember that quote. It's one of his most famous quotes. On the other hand, right on the opposite of Angela Merkel, you would have Bernie Sanders and maybe AOC, where it's big news in the last few years where prominent members of Bernie's economic policy team are subscribers to modern monetary theory, which essentially says the logical conclusion of Keynesianism, which is you can just print the money, you don't have to worry about it, it's all fake. As long as you get people to believe in it and, as long as people are fed. So.
What if people stop believing in it? What happens then? What if everybody's like, I'm going to put all my money in Bitcoin? What happens then?
The problem with that is the political side, which is that the government mandates that you pay your taxes in US dollars. And I don't ever see the federal government accepting Bitcoin or any crypto. Maybe these smaller economies around the world will. But yeah, then that's what I was saying when governments mandate what money is, and if you want to say no, I just want to do Bitcoin, well, you're going to jail. You know what I mean? So that sucks. But
yeah, I've always felt like when it comes to like stimulus and the reverse side of stimulus, which is like taxation, I've heard like Australia, they have a pretty good system of doing it where it's like when they're in the market is sort of naturally cyclical. There are going to be downturns because like for whatever reason that come, I don't want to say naturally, but inevitably when there is a downturn for whatever reason, they pump out the money. And then when times are good, they raise taxes to, offset all the debt that they accrued during the lean times. But I feel like there isn't really the political will in this country to raise taxes for any reason on anybody, anytime, at all. Like I'd be willing to raise my own taxes ever so slightly if it meant like a real return on that raise in taxes. But it's like most people are not down for that at all. Like they're not down to see stuff come out of their own paycheck. I don't know how we're going to be able to pay for stuff.
And I also think a lot of people will say like tax the rich, but I was watching like interesting videos and reading articles how if taxes on the rich are too high, the opportunity cost is it basically leads the rich to find loopholes and like hire lawyers to find loopholes. So you end up with even less taxes because of all of the rich people that end up avoiding taxes instead of paying like what you thought they would pay by raising taxes on them.
That's true.
Well, promising news on that front recently. Our current Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, she is actually started a campaign around the world to implement a global corporate tax minimum in order to, try to address the problem of companies hiding their money elsewhere or being headquartered in some random island where they don't have to pay any taxes. So that's pretty good. And on the US side, states should probably look into, or the federal government should probably look into limiting the race to the bottom that a lot of states and cities have, where if you don't play nice with companies, they'll just say, screw this, we'll go down the road to the other city or the other state, and therefore we have to compete against each other. So hopefully that's how that would get addressed.
I think we can.
Yeah, I've also felt like there should.
Sorry, William.
No, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was just to your point about or someone said they don't believe that people would ever want to increase their taxes in the US. I think it's possible to increase people's trust in the government if we do a technological revamp of all the government processes. Currently I feel when I think about the DMV, I think of paperwork and stuff. But if the government has an update and we can actually go online and track all the spending in a very easy manner, I think that's going to increase trust. So I don't think it's not possible, but I just think we need a technological revamp.
Sorry, Wilma, I was just curious about what Karen meant by track your spending.
I think there's a lot of complaint right now that you feel people feel like they put their money or they pay their taxes and nothing comes out of it. And when they try to go research and look online at government websites and stuff, I don't know where to start looking, or it's too complicated, or the data is there, but I can't see it in a very easy way or understand it in a very easy way. But I think it's possible for the government to create metrics for us that we can easily understand, and we easily know our money is going towards this for the next 5 years or something like that.
Sort of more transparency of where the dollars flow. What about the hackers though? I feel I guess my argument is part of why the one major benefit I feel for our system being so old is that it's not as readily accessible online by random people. I don't know. My concern is that if we did have a more transparent system that's more sort of a unified system that is easier to see, then you're sort of exposing it also. I feel like there would need to be really, really hard and fast safeguards in that system. Although I guess that goes for just all the time, no matter what. So never mind. My argument just devoured itself.
Why would you be willing to pay more taxes when the elected officials spending the money aren't the ones you've chosen?
Yeah, what if they spent all that money on a war with random country that you'd never heard of?
Man, wars are really good for our economy.
Yeah,
that's what it's saying.
Actually, yeah, they are. Yeah,
the government can do any program they want as long as people are employed, and war is one of those options, and it's pretty good as far as economy goes. But yeah, they should probably be doing more other things.
I remember hearing kind of stories of jet fighter planes that were built and tanks that were built ostensibly for the war on terror, but then there were too many that were built, and the reason why we kept pumping them out and we didn't really use them, they were supplying jobs in various congressional districts, and the representatives of those districts were like, hey, if we put the kibosh on this, then I'm going to lose my seat because everybody in my little town is going to like be out of a job. So we ended up having like a surplus of like tanks, and I think we ended up like selling a bunch of them to Saudi Arabia. And the same thing goes for like the war in Yemen, all the bombing that Saudi Arabia was doing on Yemen. Like a lot of those munitions were manufactured in the United States. We had a surplus. We were just like, okay, you guys can have it. Just pay us money for these munitions. So I'm not like a big fan of like spurring the economy through war, because it ends up like those munitions inevitably do get used on people that were like, I don't know. It's not a good look in my opinion.
Yeah. So what was presented today is pretty far on a far end of the spectrum as far as ideas you can have on how to manage the economy, right? Very few people would endorse this openly in the political scene, right? Because it would be probably irresponsible. I mean, there is a lot of academic research these days with modern monetary theory, but I wouldn't expect anyone to openly embrace it and expect to convince the American public that this is a good thing to do. So definitely for probably as long as we're alive, we will be concerned with lining up the numbers in the accounting, making sure programs are paid for, right? The debt that is the debt that is currently accruing every second, we need to find a way to at least find some type of balance.
I think Joy brought up the idea of public banking. I don't know if everybody's aware of that as a thing.
So public banking is something that started in San Francisco. It's basically a taxes that so San Franciscans will pay taxes to like city, state, and like federal, but like a taxes in San Francisco taxes, it would go into the interests of San Franciscans instead of like a having it done elsewhere. Vanessa can elaborate more on that if they're there, because this is closer to what Vanessa does. But yeah, it's something that San Franciscans are looking into and hopefully bringing it to the state level too. So then the taxes that we pay go back into our infrastructure and like our cities and our public programs. Vanessa is doing their essay, that's probably why.
Yeah, because most of the things you use at whatever bank you use right now is relatively simple, right? You get your direct deposit, you have a credit card, you have a debit card, maybe you borrow money to buy a house. You don't need that money to be used in certain ways where the huge banks like JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, they use your money and they can pursue certain investment strategies that may or may not be responsible. There's no longer a barrier between your deposits and their speculative investment strategies. So that's one of the benefits of a public bank. Cashback. Yeah, like Chase, if you open a new account, they give like $200. I mean, you can do that and then get out of it, you know what I'm saying? Take advantage of it.
Yeah, I can't say anything on that for sure, but I know like the policy is still being drafted and revised and brought to the state level. I think on the city level, it did get enough traction for it to pass. So I can look more into that and let you know. And I'll ask my friend who was the one who drafted the legislation. So yeah.
I heard Los Angeles was also putting together something like that, but that was a few years ago. And there was like a citywide proposition that they would want to make a public banking something or other that wasn't like a credit union. It was like a public bank. I don't know if that passed though, because I don't know. I didn't follow up on that. Do you know what happened with that?
I'm not completely sure about that either. So I'll ask some people. Or we can look into the voting results.
Okay, does anybody have any parting thoughts on the general topic? If not, we are going to be uploading this on YouTube and it'll be accessible through our website. If you would like to stay connected, please shoot Carmen your email in the Zoom chat and we'll add you to our mailing list. And we're gonna invite everybody through Facebook for next month's event. Again, we try to do one talk per month. So if anybody has anything they want to talk about, anything they're researching, anything they're studying, and they want to talk about it, practice public speaking, hit us up. We'll be ready for you. Will, you want to bring up the book club?
Yeah, so this in like 2 weeks or so. Yes, exactly 2 weeks from now, on May 1st, I think at 2 p.m., May 1st, we will have our first book club meeting. We were decided on reading Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. And yeah, so read it. You still have 2 weeks. Even if you haven't finished it, you feel free to join us. Even if you haven't read it, feel free to join us because we will be deciding at the end of that meeting, we will be deciding the next month's book. So if you have a suggestion that you're really itching for other people to read, come see us and we'll talk about it. It'll be great. I'll probably send out an email, sometime in the next week with like the link. And then I think for the meeting, like host a meeting on Zoom that lasts longer than 40 minutes. So I don't know, Carmen, if you could set up the meeting thing.
Yeah.
The meeting. Yeah. So yes. Include previous recommendations. Yeah, I think I'm gonna try it. I think what I want to do future tense is to pare down the recommendations so that it's only one person, one recommendation. So you bring your most, the one book that you would want to recommend will be the one book. So I remember I recommended like 3 books. So I'll try to only bring one recommendation. Yeah. So hope to see everybody there.
Next month, May 29th, Sabrina will do Excel shortcuts. And then in June, Crystal will discuss nutrition and sleeping. And then July, housing crisis in Bay Area. I don't have anything scheduled for after that, but if you're interested, let me know and we can definitely schedule a time.
All right, thanks everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. And see you guys soon.